The phone buzzed at 11 at night, and Ethan Brooks felt his stomach drop before he even looked at the screen. The number was blocked. He was standing in the kitchen of his new house in Chicago, still wearing his gray suit from the office, a glass of water halfway to his lips. Grace was upstairs, humming softly while she folded laundry, unaware that the man she loved was about to receive a message that could tear their life apart. He answered on the third ring. There was silence for a moment, then a voice he had not heard in almost 6 years. "Hello, Nathan," the voice said. "It has been a long time." Ethan's hand tightened around the phone. Nobody had called him that name since he left Denver. Nobody was supposed to know that name anymore. He walked quickly into the hallway, away from the stairs, away from any chance that Grace might hear. "You have the wrong number," he said, keeping his voice low and even. "I don't think I do," the voice replied. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Brooks, or should I say, Mr. Cole. I have been looking for you for a long time, and now that I have found you, I think it is time we had a conversation. A real one, face to face." The call ended before Ethan could respond. He stood frozen in the hallway, his heart pounding against his ribs, the glass of water still in his other hand, forgotten. Upstairs, Grace called down to ask if he wanted tea. He forced his voice to sound normal. "No, thank you, love," he called back. "I will be up in a minute." But he did not go up for almost 20 minutes. He stood in that hallway, staring at his own reflection in the dark window, trying to remember how to breathe normally. The past he thought he had buried had just found him, and it had found him in the one place he had built to be safe. 3 years earlier, Ethan Brooks did not exist. The man who lived in Chicago, who worked at Whitfield Grant Financial Group, who had a warm laugh and a talent for making nervous clients feel calm, had been born the day a frightened man named Nathan Cole boarded a bus out of Denver with 2 bags and enough cash to disappear. Nathan had grown up in a small town outside Denver, the son of a mechanic and a nurse, and he had always been good with numbers. He worked hard, studied harder, and eventually landed a position at a respected investment firm led by a charming, silver-haired man named Charles Whitfield. For 2 years, Nathan believed he had found the career of his dreams. He trusted his mentor completely. He believed every word Charles told him about the clients, about the funds, about the promises made to ordinary people who had placed their retirement savings into the firm's care. Then one afternoon, while reviewing account records that did not add up, Nathan discovered something that made his blood run cold. Millions of dollars belonging to clients had quietly vanished into accounts that led nowhere good. He brought his concerns to Charles, expecting shock, expecting gratitude for catching the problem early. Instead, he saw something in his mentor's eyes that he had never seen before: calculation, coldness. Within weeks, the firm collapsed under investigation. Somehow, in the chaos that followed, blame shifted in a direction Nathan never expected. Documents appeared with his name on them. Emails he never wrote were suddenly in his inbox. A woman named Diane Holt, a colleague who had trusted him, who had considered him a friend, lost almost everything she had saved for her retirement, and when she looked for someone to blame, the name placed in front of investigators was his. Nathan tried to fight it. He hired a lawyer he could barely afford. He gathered what evidence he could to show that the real architect of the fraud was Charles Whitfield, not him. But evidence has a way of disappearing when powerful people do not want it found. And lawyers have a way of encouraging frightened young men to consider other options when the case against them looks unwinnable. The night before his hearing, Nathan Cole packed 2 bags and left everything behind. He told himself it was temporary, that he would find a way to clear his name later, once he understood who he could trust and who he could not. He changed his last name through a distant relative's records, built a new history for himself using skills he had picked up from studying financial systems his entire career, and slowly, carefully, became Ethan Brooks. It took him 2 years to feel safe enough to build a real life again. He moved to Chicago, took an entry-level position at a much smaller firm, and worked his way up through sheer discipline and talent. Nobody there knew about Denver. Nobody asked questions about a past he never discussed. He was careful, he was quiet, and slowly he began to believe that Nathan Cole was gone for good, replaced completely by the successful, respected man he had become. That was until he met Grace Mallory. Grace taught third grade at a public school on the north side of the city. She had warm brown eyes, an easy laugh, and a way of looking at people that made them feel like they were the only person in the room. Ethan met her at a charity fundraiser his firm sponsored, and from the very first conversation, he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Comfort, safety, the dangerous, wonderful feeling of being seen. At first, his interest in her was not entirely innocent. His firm's senior partners had been quietly discussing his future, hinting that a stable, respectable marriage would help his image as he moved toward a partnership position. Clients trusted married men more, they told him. Investors felt more comfortable placing their futures in the hands of someone who had built a stable life. Ethan told himself that courting Grace was simply smart timing, a strategic decision that happened to align with genuine attraction. But somewhere between their second date and their 10th, something shifted. He found himself thinking about her when she was not there. He found himself wanting to protect her, not use her. He told himself that his past did not matter anymore, that Nathan Cole belonged to a different life entirely, and that Ethan Brooks could give Grace everything she deserved without ever needing to mention a name she had never heard. He proposed on a cold evening in November, on the same bridge where they had shared their first kiss. Grace cried when she said yes, and Ethan, watching her face light up with pure joy, felt something twist painfully in his chest. Guilt, buried so deep he had almost forgotten what it felt like, rose up and settled over his happiness like a shadow. He pushed the feeling down. He told himself that the past was the past, that no one from Denver would ever think to look for him in Chicago, under a different name, living a completely different life. He told himself that marrying Grace was not a lie, because everything he felt for her was true. Only the man she thought she was marrying was not entirely real. Now, standing in his dark hallway with his phone still warm in his hand, Ethan understood how wrong he had been. Someone had found him. Someone knew both names, knew about Denver, knew enough to call him at 11 at night, and use a name he had not answered to in years. He thought about Diane Holt, the colleague whose life had been ruined alongside his own. He thought about Charles Whitfield, the man who had built an empire on other people's trust and walked away clean while everyone around him paid the price. He wondered which of them, or who else entirely, was on the other end of that call. Upstairs, he heard Grace moving around their bedroom, getting ready for sleep, completely unaware that her husband-to-be was standing in the dark, terrified that everything he had built for her, for them, was about to come crashing down. He finally climbed the stairs, forcing a smile onto his face before he reached the bedroom door. Grace looked up from the bed, her hair loose around her shoulders, and smiled at him with the kind of open trust that made his chest ache. "Everything okay?" she asked. "You look pale." "Just tired," he said, sitting down beside her, taking her hand in his. "Long day at work." She squeezed his hand and leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a moment, Ethan let himself believe that things could still be okay. That whoever had called him could be handled, reasoned with, kept away from the life he had built. That Grace never needed to know about Nathan Cole, about Denver, about the millions of dollars that had disappeared, and the friendship that had been destroyed in the process. But deep down, in the part of himself he tried hardest to ignore, Ethan Brooks knew the truth. The past does not stay buried forever. And the woman lying beside him, the woman who trusted him completely, who had agreed to build a life with him without knowing his real name, was about to become the one person capable of either saving him or destroying everything he had worked so hard to hide. Outside their window, 3 floors below, a man sat in a parked car, watching the light in their bedroom finally go dark. He wrote something in a small notebook, closed it, and started the engine. He had waited 6 years for this moment. He was not going anywhere. Grace Mallory had always trusted her instincts, and for the first few weeks after that strange night, her instincts told her something had changed in her husband. Not in obvious ways, Ethan still kissed her good morning, still asked about her students, still laughed at her jokes over dinner. But there was a distance in his eyes now, a kind of watchfulness that had not been there before. He checked his phone more often. He flinched when it rang. He started locking his study door, something he had never done in the 2 years they had been together. She told herself it was work stress. Ethan had mentioned, in vague terms, that the firm was going through a difficult stretch, that a major client was unhappy, that the partners were putting pressure on everyone to perform. It made sense. Financial jobs were demanding, and Ethan had always taken his responsibilities seriously. She decided not to push, not to ask too many questions, because she trusted him completely, and because pushing had never gotten her anywhere good with the few secretive people she had known in her life. What Grace did not know was that the man who had called Ethan that night had a name of his own, and a plan that had been years in the making. Victor Lane was not a police officer, though he had trained as one many years ago before deciding that private investigation suited his patients better than a badge ever had. He was 53 years old, quiet, careful, and relentless in a way that made people underestimate him until it was too late. Diane Holt had hired him 4 years earlier, after her lawyers told her there was nothing more they could do, after the statute of limitations closed doors that anger alone could not reopen. Diane had lost more than money in the collapse of Whitfield Grant. She had lost her house, her marriage, and for a long time her sense of who she could trust. She had been questioned by investigators for months, her name dragged through local papers alongside Nathan Cole's, even though she had done nothing but trust the wrong people. Charles Whitfield had settled quietly with the largest investors and slipped away into early retirement in another state, untouched by any serious consequence. Nathan Cole had vanished entirely. Diane could not chase Charles Whitfield. His lawyers were too good, his connections too deep, and the case against him too carefully buried under years of paperwork and settlements. But Nathan Cole was different. Nathan Cole had run. And in Diane's mind, a man who runs is a man who has something to hide or something to prove. She hired Victor not for revenge, not for anything that would put her back in a courtroom, but because she needed to understand what had truly happened. She needed to know whether Nathan Cole had been a victim like her, caught in Charles Whitfield's scheme and blamed unfairly, or whether he had been a willing partner who abandoned her the moment things went wrong. 6 years of silence had left that question eating away at her, and she could not move forward with her life until she had an answer. Victor had tracked identity changes before, and he was good at his work. It took him nearly 2 years to find the first real thread, a small clue buried in a database of professional licenses, a Chicago financial advisor named Ethan Brooks, whose early employment history contained a gap that did not quite add up. It took another year of careful, patient watching to be certain. The handwriting on old training documents matched. A childhood photograph, obtained through a distant cousin who still lived near Denver, matched the bone structure of the man's face, aged appropriately by time. By the time Victor made that first phone call, he had already spent months learning everything he could about Ethan Brooks's life in Chicago. He knew about the promotion at Whitfield Grant Financial Group, a name Ethan must have chosen with some dark, private irony given his history. He knew about the engagement to a schoolteacher named Grace Mallory. He knew their routines, their favorite restaurant, the church where they planned to hold their wedding in the spring. He had not decided yet whether Ethan Brooks deserved sympathy or condemnation. That decision would come later, once he had heard the man's side of the story. For now, his job was simply to make contact, to let Nathan Cole know he had been found, and to see how a cornered man behaved when the past finally caught up with him. 2 days after the phone call, Ethan received an envelope at his office with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, an old picture of himself standing outside the Denver office of Whitfield Grant, taken the week before everything fell apart. On the back, in neat handwriting, were 4 words: "We need to talk." Ethan sat at his desk for a long time after opening that envelope, the photograph trembling slightly in his hands. He had almost convinced himself the phone call had been some strange mistake, a wrong number, a prank. This left no room for that kind of comfortable denial. Someone knew exactly who he was, and that someone was not going away. He thought about telling Grace everything. The idea flickered through his mind more than once that week, late at night while she slept peacefully beside him, unaware of the storm building around them. He imagined the conversation, imagined sitting her down and explaining who Nathan Cole had been, what had happened in Denver, why he had changed his name and rebuilt his entire life around a lie of omission that had grown larger with every year he stayed silent. But every time he imagined that conversation, he saw the look that would cross her face. Not just shock, not just hurt, but a deep, permanent shift in the way she saw him. He had built their entire relationship on the foundation of Ethan Brooks, a man with no shadows, no secrets, no reason for anyone to doubt him. If he told her the truth now, she would have to ask herself which parts of their relationship had been real, and which had simply been the careful performance of a man protecting himself. He could not risk that. Not yet. Not until he understood exactly what Victor Lane wanted, and whether there was a way to make this problem disappear without Grace ever needing to know it had existed at all. He agreed to meet Victor 3 days later at a quiet diner far from his office, far from anywhere he might be recognized. He told Grace he had a late meeting with a client. It was, he realized with a fresh wave of guilt, the first outright lie he had told her since they met. Victor was already seated in a back booth when Ethan arrived, a cup of black coffee in front of him, his expression unreadable. He gestured for Ethan to sit, and for a long moment neither man spoke. Ethan studied the investigator's face, searching for some sign of malice, some sign of what he was walking into, but found only patience. "You look well, Mr. Brooks," Victor finally said, using the new name deliberately, watching Ethan's reaction closely. "Chicago suits you. A good job, a beautiful fiancé, a fresh start. Must be nice, building a whole new life while the people you left behind picked up the pieces of the old one." "I did not build a fraud scheme," Ethan said quietly, his voice tight with years of suppressed frustration. "I found it, I reported it, and I was the one who got blamed." "That is what I am here to find out," Victor said. "Whether that is true, or whether it is simply the story you tell yourself to sleep at night." Ethan felt anger rise in his chest, sharp and sudden. "You have no idea what I went through. I lost everything. My name, my career, the trust of people I respected. I ran because staying meant going to prison for a crime I did not commit, orchestrated by a man everyone trusted more than me." "Charles Whitfield," Victor said, watching him carefully. "Yes, Charles Whitfield." Ethan's hands were shaking now, and he pressed them flat against the table to steady them. "He built that entire operation for years before I ever joined the firm. When I found the discrepancies in the accounts, I brought them straight to him because I trusted him. I thought he would be grateful. Instead, within weeks, evidence appeared that made it look like I had orchestrated everything myself. I never had the resources to fight that kind of manipulation." Victor was quiet for a long moment, studying the younger man across from him with an expression that had softened slightly, though his eyes remained sharp. "There is a woman named Diane Holt," he said finally. "She lost her retirement savings, her marriage, and 4 years of her life trying to understand what happened to her. She is the one who hired me to find you." Ethan's stomach twisted at the name. He remembered Diane clearly, remembered her kindness in his early days at the firm, remembered the horror on her face the day the investigation went public and her name appeared beside his in the newspapers. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to fight the accusations. I hired a lawyer, but the evidence against me was overwhelming, and my lawyer told me I would likely lose at trial regardless of the truth. I panicked. I ran. I have regretted it every single day since." "Regret is easy to claim," Victor said. "It is much harder to prove. Diane deserves to know the truth, whatever it is. And so, I think, does the woman waiting for you at home, who has no idea that the man she is planning to marry is not entirely who he says he is." The mention of Grace hit Ethan like a physical blow. "Leave her out of this," he said sharply. "She has nothing to do with any of it." "She has everything to do with it," Victor replied evenly. because you married your new identity into her life without her knowledge or consent. Whatever happens next, Mr. Brooks, that is a truth that will eventually surface, whether you choose to reveal it or whether I do." Ethan left the diner that night with his mind spinning, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him like a physical thing. Victor had given him 2 weeks. 2 weeks to decide whether he would cooperate, provide evidence to help prove Charles Whitfield's guilt, and face whatever consequences came from revealing his true identity, or whether he would continue running, knowing that Victor Lane, and by extension Diane Holt, would not simply disappear. He drove home slowly that night, rehearsing conversations he knew he would never actually have, searching for some version of the truth that would not destroy the life he had so carefully built. When he finally walked through his front door, Grace was waiting up for him, curled on the couch with a book, a soft lamp casting warm light across the living room. She looked up and smiled, that same open, trusting smile that had first drawn him to her, and Ethan felt his chest tighten with a fear more powerful than anything Victor Lane could threaten him with. The fear of losing her. The fear of watching that trust disappear the moment she learned the truth about the man she loved. "How was your meeting?" she asked, setting her book aside and reaching for his hand. Ethan sat down beside her, forcing a tired smile onto his face, and told his second outright lie of the week. "Long," he said, "but it is handled now." Grace had no way of knowing how far from true those words really were. And somewhere across the city, in a small apartment filled with old newspaper clippings and years of careful research, Victor Lane sat at his desk, dialing a number that would set the next stage of this story into motion. "Diane," he said when the line connected, "I found him, and I think you need to hear what he had to say." Diane Holt had not slept properly in 4 years, not since the morning she opened her bank statement and found her retirement account nearly empty, the number so small it barely resembled the life savings she had spent 3 decades building. When Victor called her that night with news that he had finally found Nathan Cole, she sat perfectly still at her kitchen table for almost 10 minutes before she could bring herself to respond. "Tell me everything," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm building inside her chest. Victor recounted the conversation carefully, describing Ethan's reaction, his claims of innocence, the fear that had flashed across his face at the mention of Charles Whitfield's name. He told her about the woman named Grace, about the wedding planned for spring, about a man who appeared to have built an entirely new, respectable life, while the people he left behind continued struggling with the wreckage of the old one. Diane listened without interrupting, and when Victor finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Do you believe him?" she finally asked. "That he was innocent, that Whitfield set him up?" "I believe he believes it," Victor said carefully. "Whether that belief is accurate is something we still need to prove. Memory has a way of reshaping itself over time, especially when a man is trying to live with the choices he made." Diane closed her eyes, picturing Nathan Cole as she had known him years ago. A quiet, hard-working young man who had always been kind to her, who had stayed late helping her understand new software when she struggled with it, who had brought her coffee on hard mornings without ever being asked. She had liked him. She had trusted him. And when his name appeared alongside hers in the investigation, she had felt a betrayal so sharp it had taken years to dull into something she could carry without falling apart every single day. "I want to meet him," she said finally. "Not through you, face to face. I need to look him in the eye and decide for myself whether I believe what he is telling you." Victor hesitated. "That could complicate things. If he panics, if he feels cornered by both of us at once, he might simply disappear again. He has already proven he is capable of that. Then we need to make sure he understands that running will not solve anything this time," Diane said. "Set up the meeting, Victor. I have waited 4 years for answers. I am not waiting any longer than necessary." 2 days later, Ethan received a message from Victor with a time, a location, and 4 words that made his stomach drop entirely. "Diane wants to see you." He almost did not go. He spent the morning of the meeting pacing his office, staring at his phone, imagining a dozen different ways the conversation could unfold, none of them ending well. But somewhere beneath the fear, a quieter voice reminded him that he had spent 6 years running from this exact conversation, and that running had never actually made him feel free. It had only made him feel hollow, a man performing a life rather than living one. He met Diane at a small park near the lake, chosen deliberately for its openness, its lack of hidden corners where either of them might feel trapped. She was sitting on a bench when he arrived, older than he remembered, her dark hair now streaked with gray, her posture tired in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with years of struggle. When she looked up and saw him, something complicated crossed her face, a mixture of recognition, anger, and something almost like relief. "You look different," she said, as he sat down beside her, keeping careful distance. "I had to become someone different," he replied quietly. "I am sorry, Diane. I have wanted to say that for 6 years and I never found the courage." "Sorry does not undo what happened to me," she said, her voice sharp but not unkind. "I lost my house. My husband left because he could not handle the stress of the investigation, the reporters, the whispers from people we had known for 20 years. I had to start completely over at 52 years old, with nothing left except a reputation nobody in this industry would touch." Ethan felt every word like a physical blow, guilt washing over him in waves he had spent years trying to suppress. "I never wanted any of that to happen to you," he said. "When I found the discrepancies, I genuinely believed I was doing the right thing by reporting them to Charles. I had no idea he would turn everything around on me so completely, so quickly. By the time I understood what was happening, I had already been framed with evidence I could not disprove." "Then why run?" Diane asked, turning to look at him directly. "If you were truly innocent, why not stay and fight? Why leave the rest of us to face the consequences alone, while you disappeared to build a whole new life?" It was the question Ethan had asked himself every single day for 6 years, and he still did not have an answer that fully satisfied even himself. "My lawyer told me the evidence looked overwhelming," he said slowly. "He told me that even with the truth on my side, a jury would likely convict me because the paper trail all pointed in my direction, carefully constructed to do exactly that." I panicked. I was 26 years old, terrified of prison, terrified of losing everything, and I made a choice I have regretted every day since. I am not proud of it. I am not asking you to forgive it. But I need you to understand that I did not choose to leave you and everyone else to suffer. I chose fear over courage, and that failure belongs entirely to me." Diane studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "There is a woman," she said finally. "Victor told me you are engaged." Ethan's chest tightened. "Yes." "Does she know any of this?" He looked away, out across the water, unable to meet Diane's eyes. "No," he admitted. "She thinks she is marrying Ethan Brooks, a man with no complicated past, no reason for her to ever doubt him." "That is not fair to her," Diane said quietly, and something in her tone had shifted, no longer purely angry but tinged with something closer to sadness. "I know what it feels like to trust someone completely, to build a life around that trust, and then discover the ground beneath you was never as solid as you believed. She deserves better than that, Nathan. Whatever her name is, she deserves the truth before she marries a man whose entire identity is built on a lie of omission." "I know," Ethan said, his voice breaking slightly. "I am terrified of losing her, but I am starting to understand that keeping this secret is not protecting her. It is only protecting myself." They sat in silence for a long time after that, watching the water, each carrying the weight of their own history. Finally, Diane spoke again. "I want you to help Victor build a real case against Charles Whitfield," she said. "Documents, records, anything you kept from those days that could prove what he did, what role you actually played. If you are truly innocent, prove it. Not to me. To everyone who still believes you destroyed my life on purpose." Ethan nodded slowly. "I still have some records," he said. "I copied files before I left, thinking I might need them someday to defend myself. I never had the courage to use them. I was too afraid of drawing attention back to myself." "Then it is time to stop being afraid," Diane said, standing from the bench. "You have 2 weeks, Nathan. Bring Victor everything you have. After that, I intend to move forward with or without your cooperation, and I promise you the truth is coming out one way or another." She walked away without looking back, leaving Ethan alone on the bench, staring out at the gray water, the weight of the coming weeks settling over him like a physical thing. That evening, he came home later than usual, his mind consumed with thoughts of old files hidden in a storage unit across the city. Files he had not looked at in years, files that could either save him or destroy him depending on how the truth was ultimately received. He found Grace in the kitchen, cooking dinner, humming quietly to herself the way she always did when she was content. "You have been distracted lately," she said, without turning around, stirring something on the stove. "Distant. Is everything okay at work?" "It is complicated," Ethan said carefully, sitting down at the kitchen table. "There is a situation from a long time ago before we met that is resurfacing. I am trying to handle it the right way this time." Grace turned to look at him, concern flickering across her face. "What kind of situation?" He hesitated, the truth rising in his throat, so close to finally escaping after years of careful containment. But fear won again as it had so many times before. "Old business dealings," he said vaguely. "Nothing that involves you. I just need some time to sort through it properly." Grace studied him for a long moment, and Ethan could see the questions building behind her eyes, questions she was choosing not to ask yet. Out of trust, out of love, out of the belief that whatever he was dealing with, he would tell her when he was ready. She returned to the stove, and the conversation moved on to lighter things: wedding plans, a difficult student in her classroom, weekend plans with friends. But later that night, after Grace had fallen asleep, Ethan lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about Diane's words. She deserves the truth before she marries a man whose entire identity is built on a lie. He knew she was right. He knew that every day he delayed the conversation, he was making the eventual damage worse, deepening a betrayal that would only grow harder to forgive with time. He got up quietly, careful not to wake Grace, and made his way to his study, locking the door behind him out of habit rather than necessity. He opened the small safe hidden in his closet and pulled out an old, worn folder, its edges soft from years of handling. Inside were copies of financial records he had gathered in his final desperate weeks at Whitfield Grant, records that documented irregular transfers, hidden accounts, and Charles Whitfield's signature on documents that should never have existed if the firm had been operating honestly. He spread the papers across his desk, studying them for the first time in years, memories flooding back with painful clarity. He remembered the exact moment he had discovered the first discrepancy, late one night working alone in the office, the sick feeling that had settled in his stomach as he realized something was deeply wrong. He remembered bringing his concerns to Charles the next morning, full of naive confidence that doing the right thing would be rewarded rather than punished. He spent the next several hours organizing the documents, cross-referencing dates, building a timeline that told a very different story than the one investigators had believed 6 years ago. By the time he finally closed the folder and returned it to the safe, the sky outside had begun to lighten with early dawn, and Ethan felt something he had not felt in a very long time: a fragile, cautious sense of hope. Perhaps, he thought, there was still a way to fix this, to clear his name, to help Diane find the justice she deserved, and somehow, impossibly, to find a way to tell Grace the truth without losing her entirely. He had no way of knowing, as he finally climbed back into bed beside his sleeping fiancée, that Charles Whitfield had already learned, through old contacts still loyal to him, that Nathan Cole had resurfaced in Chicago, and that documents from his past were once again in danger of coming to light. Somewhere across the city, in an office far more powerful than Ethan's own, a decision was already being made about how far Charles Whitfield was willing to go to keep his secrets buried for good. Charles Whitfield had built his entire life on the careful management of appearances, and even in retirement, tucked away in a quiet coastal town far from Denver, he had not lost his instinct for detecting threats before they fully formed. When an old associate mentioned, almost in passing, that a private investigator had been asking questions about a former employee named Nathan Cole, Charles felt a familiar coldness settle over him. The same calculating calm that had once allowed him to redirect an entire investigation onto the shoulders of an innocent young man without losing a single night of sleep. He made a few careful phone calls that week, calls that left no trace, calls made from a phone that could not easily be connected back to him. He learned Nathan Cole's new name, his new city, his upcoming marriage to a schoolteacher, and the uncomfortable fact that Diane Holt had hired someone competent enough to find him after 6 years of careful hiding. None of this pleased him. Charles had spent years cultivating a quiet, respectable retirement, and he had no intention of allowing old ghosts to threaten the comfortable life he had built for himself using other people's money. He did not yet know what evidence Nathan might still possess, but he understood enough about the young man's meticulous nature to suspect he had kept something, some form of insurance gathered during those final desperate weeks at the firm. If that evidence surfaced now, properly organized and presented to the right authorities, it could unravel everything Charles had spent years protecting. He decided, calmly and without hesitation, that steps needed to be taken to ensure Nathan Cole remained exactly where he had been for the past 6 years. Quiet, compliant, silent. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Grace Mallory's patience with her fiancé's distant behavior was beginning to wear thin. It had been almost 3 weeks since that first strange night, and Ethan had grown increasingly withdrawn, disappearing for hours at a time under vague explanations about work, locking himself in his study for entire evenings, flinching whenever his phone rang unexpectedly. She loved him deeply, and that love had kept her patient far longer than most people might have managed. But patience without answers eventually curdles into worry, and worry, left unaddressed, curdles into suspicion. One Saturday afternoon, while Ethan was out running an errand he had described only as important, Grace found herself standing outside his locked study door, a feather duster in her hand, telling herself she was simply cleaning the house as she did every weekend. But her feet carried her closer to that door than usual, and she found herself trying the handle, not quite admitting to herself what she was hoping to find. It was locked, as it always was now, but as she stepped back, her eyes caught on something small tucked beneath the edge of the doormat outside the study. A spare key Ethan must have hidden there without realizing she occasionally swept beneath the mats while cleaning. She stood frozen for a long moment, the small brass key resting in her palm, torn between respect for his privacy and a growing need to understand what was causing the man she loved so much visible distress. In the end, trust won, at least for that afternoon. She placed the key back exactly where she had found it and walked away from the study door, telling herself that Ethan would explain everything when he was ready, that pushing would only make him retreat further. But something had shifted inside her that day, a small seed of doubt planted where unwavering trust had once stood alone. That evening, over a quiet dinner, Grace finally decided to ask the question she had been holding back for weeks. "Ethan," she said carefully, setting down her fork, "I need you to be honest with me. Is there something happening that you are not telling me? Something serious?" Ethan's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and for a brief moment something flickered across his face that Grace had never seen before. Fear, quickly masked, replaced by a carefully composed expression of calm reassurance. "It is just work stress," he said, reaching for her hand across the table. "A difficult client situation from before we met. I promise you it has nothing to do with us." "It feels like it has everything to do with us," Grace said quietly. "You barely talk to me anymore. You lock yourself away in your study every night. You jump every time your phone rings. That is not normal work stress, Ethan. That is fear. I can see it on your face." Ethan looked down at their joined hands, guilt washing over him in a familiar, exhausting wave. Every instinct told him this was the moment, the opening he needed to finally tell her the truth, to explain about Nathan Cole and Denver, and the 6 years he had spent hiding from a past that refused to stay buried. But the fear of watching her face change, of watching that trust and love shift into something colder, held his tongue in place. "I am handling it," he said instead, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "I promise you, Grace, I am not hiding anything that threatens us. I just need a little more time to sort things out properly. Please trust me. Grace studied his face for a long moment, searching for something she could not quite name, and finally nodded, though the doubt in her chest had not fully disappeared. Okay, she said. I trust you. But Ethan, whatever this is, please do not let it destroy what we have built together. Talk to me before it gets worse. If only he had listened to her that night. So much of what followed might have unfolded differently. 3 days later, Ethan arrived at his office to find a message waiting from the firm's senior partner, requesting an unscheduled meeting that afternoon. He felt a familiar unease settle over him as he walked into the corner office overlooking the city, uncertain what to expect. The senior partner, a stern but generally fair man named Oliver Grant, gestured for him to sit, his expression unusually serious. "Ethan," Oliver said, folding his hands on the desk in front of him. "I received a strange call this morning. Someone claiming to represent a former business associate of yours, asking pointed questions about your background before you joined this firm. Your employment history, your references, your education records. Is there something I should know about?" Ethan felt the blood drain from his face, though he forced himself to remain outwardly calm. "I am not sure what you mean," he said carefully. "My background has been thoroughly documented since I joined the firm." "That is what concerns me," Oliver said, leaning forward slightly. "Because when my assistant tried to verify some of the details from this caller's questions against our own records, she found a few inconsistencies. Small things. Dates that do not quite align, an employer listed on an early resume that no longer seems to exist under that exact name. I am not accusing you of anything, Ethan. You have been an excellent employee, and your work has never given me reason for concern. But I need you to understand that if there is something in your past that could reflect poorly on this firm, I need to hear it from you directly, before I hear it from someone else." Ethan sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the moment pressing down on him with crushing force. This was it, he realized. The careful, controlled world he had built around himself was beginning to crack, piece by piece, faster than he had ever anticipated. He thought about lying, about constructing some plausible explanation for the discrepancies, but he was suddenly, overwhelmingly tired of lying. Tired of carrying the weight of a secret that grew heavier with every passing year. "There are things about my past that I have not been fully honest about," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "Not with this firm, and not with everyone in my personal life either. I promise you, Oliver, nothing I did was criminal or dishonest in the way you might be imagining. But 6 years ago, I was involved in a situation at a previous firm that ended very badly, through no real fault of my own, and I made the difficult decision to start over under different circumstances, rather than face consequences I did not believe I deserved." Oliver's expression remained carefully neutral, though Ethan could see him processing the weight of this admission. "I appreciate your honesty," he said finally, "but I need more than vague reassurances, Ethan. If this situation resurfaces publicly, it could seriously damage this firm's reputation, along with your own. I want you to bring me the full story, properly documented, by the end of this week. After that, we will discuss how to move forward." Ethan left that meeting with his mind racing, understanding now that the walls were closing in from multiple directions at once. Diane wanted her evidence. Victor wanted the truth. Oliver Grant wanted a full accounting of his past before the firm's reputation suffered any further damage. And somewhere, unknown to him still, Charles Whitfield was quietly working to ensure that whatever evidence Ethan possessed never saw the light of day. That night he came home to find Grace waiting for him at the kitchen table, her expression unusually serious, a folded piece of paper resting in front of her. "A woman came by the school today," she said quietly, sliding the paper across the table toward him. "She said her name was Diane Holt. She asked me to give you this." Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper. Written in careful handwriting were just a few lines. "Time is running out, Nathan. Bring me what you promised, or I will have no choice but to move forward on my own, and your fiancée deserves to hear the truth from someone who cares about protecting her, before she hears it from someone who does not." Grace watched his face carefully as he read the note, and when he finally looked up, meeting her eyes across the table, she saw something in his expression that confirmed every fear she had been quietly carrying for weeks. This was not simple work stress. This was something much larger, something that had a name attached to it now. Nathan. "Who is Nathan?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to remain calm. "Ethan, who is this woman, and why is she calling you by a name I have never heard before?" The silence that followed stretched on for what felt like an eternity, and Ethan understood with painful clarity that the moment he had been avoiding for weeks had finally arrived, whether he was ready for it or not. Ethan sat down slowly across from Grace, the note still trembling slightly between his fingers, and understood that there was no version of this conversation that would leave their relationship exactly as it had been. He set the paper down carefully on the table and took a deep breath, gathering courage he had spent 6 years avoiding. "My name was not always Ethan Brooks," he said quietly, watching her face carefully as the words left his mouth for the first time in years. "I was born Nathan Cole. I grew up outside Denver. 6 years ago, I worked at an investment firm there, and something happened that changed the entire course of my life." Grace stared at him, her expression a complicated mixture of confusion and dawning horror. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. "Your name is not real. Everything you told me about yourself, your childhood, your family, was that all a lie too?" "No," Ethan said quickly, reaching for her hand, though she pulled it back before he could reach her. "My childhood was real. My parents were real, though I have not spoken to them in years, out of fear that any connection back to my old life would eventually lead people to find me. The man you fell in love with is real, Grace. I promise you that. But the name and the story I told you about my early career, those were carefully built to hide something I was too afraid to face." He told her everything then, the words pouring out after years of careful containment, describing the investment firm, the discovery of fraud, Charles Whitfield's calculated betrayal, the false evidence that had appeared seemingly overnight, painting him as the architect of a scheme he had actually tried to expose. He told her about Diane Holt, about the retirement savings that vanished, about the panic that had driven him to run rather than face a trial he believed he could not win. Grace listened in silence, her face growing paler with each new revelation, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap as though physically holding herself together. When Ethan finally finished, the kitchen fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. 6 years, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have been lying to me since the day we met. Every conversation about your past, every story about your childhood job, your first apartment, your old friends, was any of it real? Or was I just falling in love with a character you built to hide from your own past?" "It was real," Ethan said desperately, his voice cracking with emotion. "The person I am with you, the way I feel about you, none of that was ever fake, Grace. I built a new identity to survive, but everything I felt for you was completely genuine. I fell in love with you as myself, even if that self was hiding behind a different name." "How am I supposed to believe that?" Grace said, tears finally beginning to fall despite her effort to stay composed. "When I just learned that the entire foundation of our relationship was built on a name that does not even belong to you. What else have you hidden from me, Ethan or Nathan, or whoever you actually are?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and painful, and Ethan found himself unable to answer with the certainty she deserved. He had hidden so much for so long that even he was no longer entirely sure where the careful construction of Ethan Brooks ended and the truth of who he really was began. "I understand if you need time," he said quietly, watching her wipe tears from her face with trembling hands. "I understand if you never want to speak to me again. But please believe me when I say that everything I feel for you, my love, my commitment, my desire to build a future with you, none of that was ever part of the lie." Grace stood abruptly from the table, needing distance, needing air, needing space to process the collapse of everything she thought she understood about the man she was planning to marry. "I need to think," she said, her voice shaking. I cannot have this conversation right now. I am going to stay with my sister tonight. Ethan wanted desperately to stop her, to beg her not to leave, but he understood with painful clarity that he had already lost the right to demand anything from her. He watched in silence as she gathered a small bag and walked out the front door, the sound of it closing behind her echoing through the suddenly empty house like a physical blow. Grace drove to her sister's apartment in a daze, her mind replaying every conversation she had ever had with Ethan, searching for cracks she should have noticed, moments where the careful construction of his false identity might have slipped. Her sister, a warm, practical woman named Nora Bennett, opened the door within seconds of her knock, immediately sensing that something was seriously wrong. "Grace, what happened?" Nora asked, pulling her sister into a tight hug as fresh tears began to fall. Grace told her everything that night, the words tumbling out between sobs, and Nora listened with growing alarm, her arms wrapped protectively around her younger sister. "You are telling me the man you are supposed to marry in 6 months is not even using his real name?" Nora finally asked, her voice tight with barely contained anger. "Grace, that is not a small secret. That is an entire fabricated identity." "I know," Grace whispered, "but he says the person I fell in love with is real, that only the circumstances around him were hidden. I do not know what to believe anymore." Nora poured her sister a cup of tea and sat beside her on the couch, her expression thoughtful. "I think," she said carefully, "before you decide anything about your future with this man, you need to understand exactly what happened 6 years ago. Not just his version of events, but the full truth, from every angle. You deserve that much before you make any decisions about your life together." Grace nodded slowly, a fragile resolve building inside her despite the exhaustion weighing on every part of her body. "I need to talk to this Diane Holt," she said finally. "I need to hear her side of what happened without Ethan filtering the story for me." The next morning, after a mostly sleepless night, Grace found the small piece of paper Diane had left at the school, and using the phone number scrawled beneath her name, arranged to meet the woman at a small cafe near the lake. She arrived early, nervous energy coursing through her, uncertain what kind of woman she was about to meet, uncertain what truths might emerge from the conversation ahead. Diane arrived precisely on time, and Grace was struck immediately by the tired dignity in the older woman's posture, the careful way she carried herself like someone who had survived something difficult and come out the other side changed but not entirely broken. They sat across from each other for a long moment before either spoke. "Thank you for meeting me," Diane finally said. "I imagine the past few days have been incredibly difficult for you." "I need to understand what really happened," Grace said, her voice steadier than she felt inside. "Ethan told me his version last night. That he discovered fraud, reported it, and was framed for it by his mentor. I need to know if that is actually true, or if he is still protecting himself with a story that makes him sound better than he actually was." Diane was quiet for a long moment, considering the question carefully. "I have spent 4 years trying to answer that exact question myself," she finally said. "I lost everything in that collapse, and for a long time I believed Nathan Cole had been just as responsible as Charles Whitfield, simply because his name appeared alongside mine in every investigation report and newspaper article." "But you do not believe that anymore," Grace said, watching Diane's face carefully. "I am not entirely certain what I believe," Diane admitted. "But I have spent the past few weeks watching him, hearing his explanations, and comparing them against what limited evidence remains from those days. Everything he has told me lines up with what I remember from working alongside him, before everything fell apart. He was a good young man back then. Hardworking, honest, genuinely horrified when he discovered what Charles Whitfield had been doing with client funds. I do not believe he orchestrated that fraud. I believe he was made into a convenient scapegoat by a man far more powerful and far more experienced at protecting himself." Grace absorbed this information slowly, feeling something inside her chest ease slightly, though the deeper wound of his deception remained raw and painful. "Then why did he run?" she asked. "Why not stay and fight for the truth?" "Fear," Diane said simply. The same fear that has kept people silent about injustice throughout history. He was young, terrified, and facing evidence that had been carefully manufactured to look overwhelming. I cannot excuse the choice he made to run rather than fight, especially knowing it left me and others to face the consequences alone. But I understand it, in a way I did not 4 years ago, when my anger was still fresh enough to consume everything else. Grace sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything Diane had told her, the picture of her fiancé shifting and reforming in her mind with each new piece of information. "What happens now?" she finally asked. "Between you and him. He has agreed to bring me documentation that could help prove Charles Whitfield's guilt," Diane said. "If that evidence is real, if it holds up, it could finally provide the accountability I have been seeking for 4 years. But it will also mean Nathan Cole's name resurfacing publicly, along with everything that identity carries with it. Whatever decision you make about your relationship with him, Grace, I think you deserve to understand that the coming weeks are likely to bring significant public attention to both of you, regardless of what you ultimately decide." The weight of that statement settled heavily over Grace as she drove home later that afternoon, her mind spinning with the enormity of what lay ahead. She had fallen in love with a man who did not exist under the name she knew him by, a man whose past was about to become public knowledge, dragging her own life into a spotlight she had never asked for or wanted. When she finally returned to the house they shared, she found Ethan sitting alone in the darkened living room, exactly where she had left him the night before, dark circles beneath his eyes suggesting he had not slept at all. He looked up when she entered, hope and fear warring visibly across his face. "I talked to Diane," Grace said quietly, sitting down across from him rather than beside him, needing the physical distance for now. "She believes you, about the fraud, about being framed. She does not excuse what you did afterward, running instead of fighting, but she believes the core of your story is true." Ethan felt something loosen slightly in his chest, though the fear remained heavy. "Does that change anything for you?" he asked cautiously. "I do not know yet," Grace admitted honestly. "I believe you were wronged, Ethan. I believe someone you trusted destroyed your life and left you to face consequences that were never truly yours to carry. But I also know that you have been lying to me every single day for the past 2 years, and that is not something I can simply set aside because I now understand why you started the lie in the first place." "What do you need from me?" Ethan asked quietly. "Tell me and I will do it. I will do anything to prove that what we have is worth fighting for." Grace was quiet for a long moment, studying the man in front of her, searching for the version of him she had fallen in love with beneath the layers of secrets and false names. "I need you to finish what you started," she finally said. "Give Diane the evidence. Help her get justice against the man who actually did this. And I need you to be completely honest with me from this point forward, no matter how difficult or embarrassing the truth might be. If we have any chance of rebuilding trust, it starts there." Ethan nodded slowly, relief and determination mixing together in his chest. "I promise," he said, "no more secrets, Grace. Whatever happens next, you will hear it from me first always." Neither of them yet understood how quickly that promise would be tested, or how far Charles Whitfield was willing to go to ensure that the truth Ethan had promised to reveal never made it into the hands of the people who needed it most. Charles Whitfield did not believe in leaving important matters to chance, and after learning that Nathan Cole had reappeared and was actively cooperating with Diane Holt, he understood that decisive action was required before the situation spiraled beyond his control. He made a call that evening to a man he had used sparingly over the years, someone skilled in quietly resolving problems that could not be handled through ordinary legal channels. Not violence, Charles always insisted, careful even in his own private thoughts to distance himself from anything that crude. Simply persuasion, and when persuasion failed, disruption. The storage facility where Ethan kept his old files was a modest, unremarkable building on the edge of the city, chosen years ago specifically, because it drew no attention. When Ethan arrived early one morning to retrieve additional documents Diane had requested, he found the lock on his unit already broken, the door slightly ajar, and his stomach dropped with a sickening lurch even before he stepped fully inside. The unit had been searched, thoroughly and carefully, boxes overturned, papers scattered across the concrete floor. His heart pounded as he sifted through the wreckage, searching desperately for the folder containing his most critical evidence, the financial records that documented Charles Whitfield's signature on the fraudulent transfers. After several frantic minutes, he found it, tucked beneath a fallen box where it had apparently gone unnoticed, and relief flooded through him so intensely his knees nearly buckled. But the relief was short-lived. As he examined the rest of the unit more carefully, he realized that several other supporting documents were missing entirely, records that would have helped corroborate the timeline of events, emails he had printed years ago showing Charles pressuring him to approve transactions he had never fully understood at the time. Someone had known exactly what to look for, and had taken exactly enough to weaken his case without alerting him immediately to what had happened. He called Victor Lane the moment he left the storage facility, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Someone broke into my storage unit," he said. "They took some of the supporting documents. I still have the core evidence, but this is not a coincidence, Victor. Whitfield knows we are building a case against him." Victor's response was grim but calm, the voice of a man who had anticipated exactly this kind of complication. "This confirms he is taking the threat seriously," Victor said, "which means we need to move faster than originally planned. I want you to bring me everything you still have today. We cannot risk losing anything else." That afternoon, Ethan met Victor and Diane at a private office Victor sometimes used for sensitive cases, the remaining documents spread carefully across a large table between them. Diane examined each page with the intense focus of someone finally seeing pieces of a puzzle she had waited years to complete, while Victor photographed everything methodically, creating digital backups that could not be so easily stolen or destroyed. "This is enough," Diane finally said, looking up from the documents with something like cautious hope in her expression. "Not everything we might have hoped for, but enough to demonstrate a clear pattern. Combined with financial records from the original investigation, this could be sufficient to reopen the case against Charles Whitfield." "What happens to me in all of this?" Ethan asked quietly, the question he had been avoiding finally surfacing. "I ran from an investigation years ago. Even if this evidence proves Whitfield's guilt, does it erase the fact that I fled rather than facing the original inquiry?" Victor and Diane exchanged a careful glance. "It will not erase it," Victor said honestly, "but it will provide important context. A prosecutor reviewing this case will need to weigh the fact that you fled against the fact that you were actively targeted with fabricated evidence by a man protecting a much larger fraud. It may not eliminate all consequences, but it should significantly reduce them, particularly since you are now voluntarily coming forward with critical evidence rather than continuing to hide." Ethan absorbed this information slowly, understanding that even a best-case outcome likely involved some form of legal accountability for his own choices, years ago. He thought about Grace, about the wedding they had planned, about the life they had been building together, all of it now hanging precariously in the balance of decisions being made in this quiet office. Meanwhile, Grace had not been idle during these tense weeks. Determined to understand every angle of the situation threatening to consume her future, she had begun conducting her own quiet research, reading old newspaper articles about the Whitfield Grant collapse, studying the public record of the investigation, trying to build her own independent understanding of what had actually happened 6 years ago. What she found troubled her deeply. Several articles mentioned Nathan Cole's disappearance in tones that suggested clear guilt, painting him as a coward who had fled rather than face justice for financial crimes that had devastated dozens of families. She understood now, having heard both Ethan's account and Diane's perspective, that the public narrative had been incomplete, shaped by evidence Charles Whitfield had carefully manufactured. But she also could not ignore the fact that dozens of ordinary people, not just Diane, had suffered real financial devastation because of decisions made at that firm, decisions Ethan had at least partially witnessed even if he had not orchestrated them himself. She reached out to a few of the other victims mentioned in the articles, cautiously, carefully, not identifying herself as Ethan's fiancée, simply as someone researching the case. Most declined to speak with her, still too raw with old pain to revisit the subject with a stranger. But one man, an elderly retired teacher named Simon Clark who had lost a significant portion of his pension in the collapse, agreed to a brief phone conversation. "Nathan Cole," Simon said, his voice tired but not unkind when Grace mentioned the name. "I remember him. Young man, always polite when I called with questions about my account. I do not believe he orchestrated what happened to us, but I have always wondered why he vanished the way he did, rather than staying to help those of us trying to understand what happened to our savings." "Do you think he was guilty?" Grace asked carefully. "I think," Simon said slowly, "that guilt comes in many forms. Perhaps he was not the architect of the fraud, but choosing to disappear rather than face the consequences, even unfair consequences, left people like me without answers for years. That is its own kind of harm, even if it was born from fear rather than malice." Grace thanked him and ended the call, sitting alone in her car for a long time afterward, absorbing the weight of his words. Ethan's choices, whatever their origin, had caused real harm to real people, people who deserved more than the silence he had offered them for 6 years. She understood his fear now, understood the impossible position he had found himself in as a young man facing manufactured evidence and a powerful adversary. But understanding did not automatically translate into easy forgiveness, and she found herself grappling with the complicated reality that a person could be simultaneously a victim and someone whose choices had genuinely hurt others. That evening, she returned home to find Ethan waiting anxiously, having called her twice already to check that she was safe, clearly still shaken from the break-in at his storage unit. She told him about her conversation with Simon Clark, watching his face carefully as she relayed the elderly man's words. "He is right," Ethan said quietly after a long silence. "I have known that for years, even when I was too afraid to fully face it. My choice to run did not just protect me from an unfair trial. It also left people like Simon without the answers they deserved, without anyone standing up publicly to name Charles Whitfield's actual guilt. I was so focused on saving myself that I did not fully consider what my silence cost everyone else." "What do you plan to do about that now?" Grace asked, watching him carefully. "Whatever it takes to fix it," Ethan said, meeting her eyes with a steadiness she had not seen from him in weeks. "I am going to give Victor and Diane everything I have. I am going to speak publicly if that is what is needed to help reopen this case properly. And I am going to face whatever consequences come from my own choices 6 years ago, honestly and directly, rather than continuing to hide from them." Grace studied him for a long moment, something in her chest shifting slightly at the resolve in his voice. "That is going to be difficult," she said quietly. "For both of us. If this becomes public, our lives will be scrutinized in ways neither of us has experienced before." "I know," Ethan said, "and I understand if that is more than you signed up for when you agreed to marry me, but I cannot keep hiding, Grace. I have spent 6 years running from this, and it has cost me more than I ever gained by staying safe. I would rather face this honestly, with you if you will still have me, than continue living a life built on avoidance." Before Grace could respond, Ethan's phone buzzed with an incoming call, the screen displaying Oliver Grant's name. He answered cautiously, and Grace watched his expression shift from confusion to alarm as he listened to whatever the senior partner was telling him. "I understand," Ethan finally said, his voice tight. "I will be there first thing tomorrow morning." He ended the call and looked up at Grace, his face pale. "Someone sent Oliver detailed documents about the Denver investigation," he said. "Anonymous, but clearly designed to make me look as guilty as possible, cherry-picked to leave out any context about Whitfield's role. The firm is calling an emergency meeting tomorrow to discuss my employment status." Grace felt her own stomach tighten with dread, understanding immediately what this meant. Charles Whitfield, unable to destroy the physical evidence entirely, was now working to destroy Ethan's credibility and career before that evidence could ever be properly presented. The battle they had been quietly fighting in private was about to become dangerously, unavoidably public, and neither of them had any way of knowing whether Ethan's career, his freedom, or his relationship with Grace would survive what was coming next. The conference room at the top of the Whitfield Grant Financial Group building felt colder than usual the next morning as Ethan walked in to find not only Oliver Grant waiting, but two additional senior partners, along with a lawyer Ethan did not recognize, sitting stiffly at the far end of the long table. Copies of the anonymous documents Oliver had received were spread across the table, printed and highlighted in places that painted the most damaging possible picture of the events in Denver. "Sit down, Ethan," Oliver said, his voice carefully neutral, though tension radiated from every person in the room. "We received these documents yesterday evening from an anonymous source. They allege that you orchestrated a significant fraud scheme at your previous firm, fled before facing prosecution, and have been operating under a false identity ever since. I want to hear your response before this firm decides how to proceed." Ethan sat down slowly, forcing himself to remain calm despite the fear tightening his chest. This was the moment he had feared for 6 years, finally arriving in the worst possible way, filtered through carefully selected evidence designed to make him look as guilty as possible. But he also understood with sudden clarity that this was his opportunity to finally tell the complete truth in a room full of people whose judgment could determine his professional future. "Everything in those documents is technically accurate," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "but critically incomplete. Yes, I changed my identity 6 years ago. Yes, I left Denver before facing an investigation into fraud at my previous firm. But those documents leave out the most important fact of this entire story. I did not commit that fraud. I discovered it, reported it to my superior, a man named Charles Whitfield, and within weeks, evidence had been fabricated to make it appear as though I was the architect of a scheme he had actually built himself, over years, long before I ever joined that firm." He spent the next 20 minutes explaining everything, methodically, calmly, describing the discovery of the discrepancies, his naive trust in reporting them, the swift and devastating reversal that followed, and his panicked decision to flee rather than face a trial his lawyer believed he could not win. He told them about Diane Holt, about the evidence he had recently gathered with Victor Lane's help, about his decision, made just days earlier, to finally come forward and help reopen the investigation into Charles Whitfield's actual role in the collapse. When he finished, the room fell into heavy silence. Oliver studied him for a long moment, his expression difficult to read. "This is a serious situation, Ethan," he finally said. "Even accepting your version of events as true, this firm's reputation is now directly tied to a scandal you concealed for 2 years while working here under a false identity. Our clients trust us because they believe in the integrity and transparency of the people managing their money. This revelation, regardless of the underlying truth, creates significant risk for everyone associated with this firm." "I understand that," Ethan said quietly, "and I am prepared to accept whatever consequences the firm decides are appropriate. But I would ask that any decision take into account the evidence I am providing to help expose the person actually responsible for the harm done to dozens of families 6 years ago. I am not asking to avoid accountability for my own choices. I am asking to be judged on the complete truth, rather than a carefully edited version designed by the very man trying to keep his own guilt hidden." The lawyer at the end of the table finally spoke, her voice sharp and businesslike. "Who sent these documents to Mr. Grant?" she asked. "If someone is actively working to sabotage your reputation right now, that itself is significant and potentially actionable." "I believe it was Charles Whitfield or someone working on his behalf," Ethan said. "My storage unit was broken into just days ago, and several supporting documents were taken. This feels like a coordinated effort to discredit me before the evidence against him can be properly presented." The meeting continued for another hour, questions flowing back and forth as the partners worked to understand the full scope of the situation and its potential impact on the firm. By the end, no final decision had been reached, but Oliver informed Ethan that he would be placed on administrative leave while the firm's own legal counsel investigated the matter further, a decision that felt simultaneously merciful and devastating. Ethan left the building that afternoon feeling hollowed out, uncertain what remained of the career he had spent 6 years carefully rebuilding. He drove home slowly, dreading the conversation ahead with Grace, uncertain how she would react to this new complication threatening the fragile trust they had been trying to rebuild over the past difficult week. He found her waiting at the kitchen table when he arrived, and something in her expression told him she had already heard, at least partially, what had happened. "Oliver called me," she said quietly, confirming his fear. "He wanted to know if I had any information that might help the firm understand the situation better. I told him the truth, Ethan, that I only recently learned about your past myself, and that I believed your account of what happened, based on what Diane had told me." "Thank you," Ethan said, sitting down heavily across from her. "I am sorry you got pulled into this conversation as well. This is spiraling faster than I anticipated." "I think," Grace said carefully, "that this was always going to spiral the moment Victor Lane found you. The only question now is whether it spirals toward the truth finally coming out properly, or toward Charles Whitfield successfully burying it again, this time by destroying your reputation before anyone can properly hear your side of the story." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding the truth in her words. "Victor wants to move quickly," he said. "He believes we should take the evidence directly to the district attorney's office rather than waiting for a slower, more traditional investigation process. He is worried that Whitfield's next move might be even more aggressive than what happened at the firm today." "Then we should not wait," Grace said, surprising him slightly with the firmness in her voice. "Ethan, I have spent the past week trying to understand every angle of what happened to you, to Diane, to all those other families. I still have complicated feelings about the choices you made, about the years of lying that followed. But I do not believe you deserve to have your reputation destroyed by a man actively working to hide his own guilt. If moving quickly gives you the best chance of proving the truth, then we should move quickly." Ethan felt a wave of gratitude wash over him at her words, though he understood the fragility of the moment, the fact that her support did not erase the deeper wounds his years of deception had caused. "I do not deserve you," he said quietly. "After everything I have put you through these past few weeks, you are still choosing to stand beside me." "I am choosing to stand beside the truth," Grace corrected gently, though not unkindly. "Whether that means standing beside you long-term is still something I am working through, Ethan. But right now, in this moment, helping expose what Charles Whitfield actually did feels more important than my own unresolved feelings about our relationship. We can figure out the rest afterward." That evening, Ethan called Victor and confirmed his decision to move forward immediately with presenting the evidence to the district attorney's office, rather than continuing to wait and hope for a slower resolution. Victor arranged a meeting for the following morning, explaining that Diane would also be present, along with a prosecutor who had reviewed preliminary aspects of the case and expressed interest in reopening the investigation. But that night, as Ethan and Grace sat together in their living room, trying to find some small measure of normalcy amid the chaos consuming their lives, neither of them noticed the car parked quietly across the street, its driver watching their house with careful, patient attention. Charles Whitfield had received word of the emergency meeting at Ethan's firm, and understanding that his attempt to discredit Nathan Cole professionally had failed to fully derail the growing threat against him. He had made the difficult decision to take more direct action before the meeting with the district attorney could take place. He was not a man who believed in half measures. If discrediting Nathan Cole through his career had not been enough to stop this from moving forward, then more decisive intervention would be required, and Charles Whitfield had never been someone who allowed sentiment to interfere with the protection of everything he had spent his life building. The knock at the door came just after 10 that night, sharp and unexpected, and Grace felt her entire body tense at the sound. Ethan rose slowly from the couch, exchanging a wary glance with her before making his way to the front door. When he opened it, he found himself face to face, for the first time in 6 years, with the man who had destroyed his life and walked away untouched. Charles Whitfield looked older than Ethan remembered, his silver hair now fully white, but his eyes held the same cold, calculating sharpness that had once made Ethan trust him completely, before he understood what that sharpness actually concealed. "Nathan," Charles said smoothly, as though greeting an old friend rather than a man he had framed for his own crimes. "May I come in? I think we have a great deal to discuss." "I have nothing to say to you," Ethan replied, his voice steadier than he felt, positioning himself firmly in the doorway rather than stepping aside. "I think you do," Charles said, his tone still pleasant, though something harder flickered beneath the surface. "I understand you have been gathering documents, meeting with investigators, preparing to reopen an investigation that was properly closed 6 years ago. I would strongly encourage you to reconsider that path, Nathan, for your own sake and for the sake of the young woman standing behind you." Grace stepped forward at the mention of herself, her chin lifted with a courage that surprised even her. "Is that a threat?" she asked directly, meeting Charles's gaze without flinching. Charles smiled thinly, unaccustomed to being challenged so directly. "Simply an observation," he said. "Reopening old wounds rarely benefits anyone, particularly when the person doing so has his own history of running from consequences. I would think carefully, Nathan, about what you truly stand to gain from dragging both our names through a public investigation, when a quiet resolution could benefit everyone involved." "You mean money," Ethan said flatly, understanding suddenly what this visit was truly about. "You are here to offer me money to stay silent, the same way you have bought silence from everyone else who might have exposed you over the years." "I prefer to think of it as fair compensation," Charles said, "for the difficulties you experienced during our time working together. A generous sum, enough to secure your future comfortably, in exchange for allowing this matter to remain settled, as it has been for 6 years. Ethan felt a surge of anger rise within him, sharper and more certain than any fear Charles had ever managed to instill. "You destroyed my life," he said, his voice rising slightly despite his effort to remain controlled. "You destroyed Diane's life, and dozens of other families who trusted you with their futures. I spent 6 years hiding, ashamed of choices I made out of fear, choices that hurt people I cared about because I was too afraid to fight for the truth. I am done being afraid of you, Charles. Take your money and leave my house." Charles's pleasant expression finally cracked, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "You are making a serious mistake," he said quietly. "I have resources you cannot begin to imagine, Nathan, reputations that can be protected and reputations that can be destroyed, depending on how cooperative people choose to be." "Then destroy mine," Ethan said firmly. "I would rather face the truth publicly, whatever consequences come with it, than spend another 6 years hiding behind lies to protect a man who never deserved my loyalty in the first place." Charles studied him for a long moment, clearly recalculating his approach now that intimidation and bribery had both failed. Finally, without another word, he turned and walked back toward his car, disappearing into the darkness of the quiet street. Ethan closed the door slowly, his hands trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline, and turned to find Grace watching him with an expression he had not seen from her in weeks. Pride, mixed with something that looked almost like renewed hope. "You stood up to him," she said quietly. "After everything, after years of running, you finally stood up to him directly." "I should have done it 6 years ago," Ethan said, sitting down heavily on the couch, exhaustion washing over him. "But I am doing it now. That has to count for something." "It counts for a great deal," Grace said softly, sitting down beside him for the first time in days, close enough that their shoulders touched. The next morning, Ethan, Diane, and Victor met with the district attorney's office as planned, presenting the full collection of evidence they had carefully gathered and preserved. The prosecutor, a sharp, methodical woman who had handled several complex financial fraud cases over the years, reviewed the documents with careful attention, asking pointed questions about the timeline, the authenticity of the signatures, and the circumstances surrounding Ethan's departure from the firm 6 years earlier. "This is compelling," she finally said after nearly 2 hours of review. "Combined with the original investigation records and testimony from other affected clients, I believe we have sufficient grounds to formally reopen this case, with Charles Whitfield as the primary focus of the investigation this time, rather than Mr. Cole." Relief flooded through Ethan so intensely he had to steady himself against the edge of the table. "What happens to me?" he asked, the question he had been almost afraid to voice. "Your voluntary cooperation and the evidence you have provided will be taken into significant consideration," the prosecutor said carefully. "Fleeing an investigation 6 years ago is not without consequence, legally speaking, but given the circumstances, the fabricated evidence used against you at the time, and your active assistance in uncovering the truth now, I believe we can pursue a resolution that acknowledges your role without treating you as equally culpable to Charles Whitfield's actual crimes. That will likely involve some form of formal accountability, potentially probation and restitution, but I do not anticipate pursuing significant prison time given your full cooperation." Diane, who had remained mostly quiet throughout the meeting, finally spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "For years," she said, "for years of not knowing, of blaming the wrong things, of losing faith in almost everyone around me. Thank you for finally giving me a path toward real answers." The investigation into Charles Whitfield moved forward with surprising speed once formally reopened, aided significantly by the documentation Ethan had preserved, and the willingness of several other affected clients, including Simon Clark, to finally speak publicly about their experiences. Within 2 months, Charles Whitfield was formally charged with multiple counts of fraud, facing consequences he had spent 6 years believing he had permanently escaped. The public fallout was significant, exactly as Ethan and Grace had feared. News outlets picked up the story quickly, drawn to the dramatic details of a fraud scheme, a false identity, and a wrongly accused man who had finally found the courage to fight back. Ethan's photograph appeared in several articles, his history laid bare for public consumption in ways that felt deeply uncomfortable after years of careful privacy. But alongside the discomfort came something he had not expected: a slowly growing sense of relief, of freedom, of no longer needing to carry the exhausting weight of a secret that had shaped every decision of his adult life. Oliver Grant, after reviewing the full evidence presented during the investigation, ultimately decided to reinstate Ethan at the firm, though with a formal note in his file acknowledging the past deception and a probationary period during which his work would be closely monitored. It was not the outcome Ethan might have hoped for in easier circumstances, but given everything that had happened, he understood it as a fair and even generous resolution, one that allowed him to rebuild his professional reputation on a foundation of honesty rather than continued concealment. Grace, throughout these turbulent weeks, remained by his side, though their relationship had undeniably changed from the easy, uncomplicated trust they had shared before that first strange phone call. They spent long evenings talking honestly about everything Ethan had hidden, working slowly to rebuild the foundation of trust that his years of deception had damaged. It was not a quick process, and there were nights when Grace still felt the sting of betrayal fresh in her chest, moments when she questioned whether she truly knew the man she had planned to marry. But she also watched him change during those difficult weeks, watched him choose honesty and accountability again and again, even when easier paths remained available. She watched him stand up to Charles Whitfield rather than accepting a bribe that would have protected his comfort at the expense of justice for people like Diane and Simon. She watched him face public scrutiny with a steadiness he had never shown while hiding behind a false name. Slowly, carefully, she began to believe that the man beside her was finally, fully himself, without the protective layers of secrecy that had once stood between them. 6 months after that first frightening phone call, on a cool spring morning, Ethan and Grace stood together in a small garden behind Nora's house, surrounded by close friends and family who understood the full, complicated truth of the man Grace was marrying. Diane Holt sat quietly in the small crowd, invited by Grace herself, a gesture of goodwill that had brought tears to the older woman's eyes when the invitation arrived. Charles Whitfield, meanwhile, sat in a courtroom that same week, facing the formal beginning of his own reckoning. The consequences he had spent years believing he could permanently avoid finally catching up with him in full. As Ethan stood at the front of that small garden watching Grace walk toward him in a simple white dress, he found himself thinking not about the name he had once hidden behind, but about the man he had finally chosen to become. Not Nathan Cole, running scared from a past he refused to face. Not Ethan Brooks, a carefully constructed shield built from lies of omission. Just himself, flawed and imperfect, but finally, fully honest, standing before the woman who had discovered his darkest secret and chosen, despite everything, to build a future with him anyway. When Grace reached him, taking his hands in hers, she leaned close and whispered words meant only for him. "No more hiding," she said softly. "Whatever comes next, we face it together honestly from now on." "Together," Ethan repeated, the word carrying a weight and meaning it had never held for him before, and for the first time in 6 long years, he felt no fear lurking beneath his happiness. Only the quiet, hard-won peace of a man who had finally stopped running. A year passed before Charles Whitfield's trial finally reached its conclusion, and Ethan sat in the courtroom on the final day, holding Grace's hand tightly as the verdict was read aloud. Guilty on every major count. The judge, reviewing the extensive evidence and the testimony of numerous affected clients, sentenced Charles to a lengthy prison term, along with an order to repay, as much as financially possible, the millions of dollars he had stolen from people who had trusted him with their futures. Watching the man who had once controlled his entire fate being led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Ethan felt none of the triumphant satisfaction he had once imagined he might feel in this moment. Instead, he felt something quieter, more complicated. A sense of closure, certainly, but also a lingering sadness for the 6 years lost to fear, for the relationships damaged along the way, for Diane's stolen decade of security and peace of mind. Diane approached him outside the courthouse afterward, her expression softer than he had ever seen it. "It is over," she said simply. "After 4 years of searching for answers, it is finally, truly over." "Will you be okay?" Ethan asked, genuine concern coloring his voice. Diane considered the question carefully before answering. "I think so," she said. "The restitution will help rebuild some of what I lost financially, though nothing can fully replace the years of stress and uncertainty. But I finally understand what actually happened, and understanding that truth has given me a kind of peace I did not think I would ever find again. Thank you, Nathan, for finally having the courage to help me find it." It was the first time in months anyone had called him by his birth name, and Ethan realized, standing there in the bright afternoon sunlight, that the name no longer carried the same weight of fear it once had. Nathan Cole was simply the boy he had been before everything fell apart, and Ethan Brooks was the man he had chosen to become afterward, flawed and imperfect, but finally standing in the light rather than hiding in carefully constructed shadows. Simon Clark received a portion of his restitution 3 months later, enough to ease some of the financial strain that had followed him since retirement. He sent Ethan a short, handwritten letter expressing his gratitude, noting that while the money could not fully replace what had been lost, the acknowledgement of wrongdoing and the public accountability meant more to him than the settlement itself. Ethan kept that letter in his desk drawer at the office, a quiet reminder of why honesty, however difficult, had ultimately mattered more than the comfortable silence he had once chosen instead. At the firm, Ethan slowly rebuilt his professional reputation over the following months, his probationary period passing without incident as he continued demonstrating the same careful, honest diligence that had once made him one of the firm's most trusted advisors. Oliver Grant, who had taken a significant professional risk in retaining him after the scandal became public, eventually told Ethan privately that he had never regretted the decision, that watching a man rebuild his integrity from the ground up had taught him more about genuine character than years of reviewing spotless resumes ever had. 18 months after their wedding, Ethan was offered a partnership position at the firm, a milestone that once would have felt like validation of the careful, false identity he had spent years constructing. Instead, it felt like something entirely different now. Recognition, earned honestly, built on a foundation of transparency rather than careful concealment. When he told Grace the news that evening, her smile held none of the complicated shadows that had colored so many of their conversations over the past 2 difficult years. "You did this yourself," she told him, pride evident in every word. "Not the man hiding behind a false name. You, Ethan Brooks, choosing honesty even when it was terrifying, even when it cost you comfort and safety. That is who earned this partnership." Their marriage, tested so severely in its earliest days, grew stronger through the shared adversity they had faced together rather than weaker, as Grace had once feared it might. They spoke often, in quiet moments, about the importance of honesty, about the exhausting weight secrets carry, about the freedom that comes from finally setting that weight down, however frightening the process of doing so might feel in the moment. Grace continued teaching at her school, though she occasionally spoke to her students, in careful, age-appropriate terms, about the importance of honesty and courage, drawing quietly from lessons she had learned through her own difficult experience without ever revealing the specific details of her husband's past. She often thought about that terrified, trusting version of herself who had first fallen in love with a man named Ethan Brooks, and felt grateful, in a complicated way, that the journey which followed had ultimately led them to a relationship built on something far sturdier than the careful performance that had defined their earliest months together. Victor Lane, having successfully closed one of the most significant cases of his career, continued his work as a private investigator, though he often mentioned Ethan and Diane's story to new clients as an example of how patient, careful investigation could eventually uncover truths that seemed permanently buried. He and Diane remained in occasional contact over the following years, a quiet friendship forged through their shared pursuit of justice, each checking in periodically to see how the other was navigating the aftermath of a case that had consumed so much of their lives. Nora Bennett, watching her sister's marriage weather its most difficult storm and emerge stronger on the other side, often reflected that she had never seen two people work as hard to rebuild something broken as Grace and Ethan had during those difficult months. She remained close with both of them, a steady presence throughout the years that followed, grateful that her sister had ultimately found happiness with a man who had proven, through action rather than words alone, that he was capable of genuine change. Years later, when Ethan and Grace's own children were old enough to ask questions about their father's early career, Ethan would tell them a carefully honest, age-appropriate version of his story. He would tell them about the importance of doing the right thing even when it felt frightening, about the dangers of choosing easy silence over difficult truth, and about the family friend named Diane who had taught him, through her own resilience, that facing painful realities honestly was always better than the temporary comfort of hiding from them. He never fully escaped the shadow of those 6 lost years, the version of himself who had chosen fear over courage when it mattered most. But he learned, slowly and carefully, to view that period not as a permanent stain on his character, but as a difficult chapter that had ultimately taught him the true value of honesty, accountability, and the quiet, hard-won peace that comes only from finally choosing truth over comfortable deception. Grace, reflecting on their journey during a quiet anniversary dinner years later, once told him that she had learned something important through their shared ordeal as well. That love built entirely on comfortable illusions remains fragile, vulnerable to collapse the moment reality intrudes. But love that survives the difficult work of confronting hard truths together grows into something far more resilient, far more capable of weathering whatever challenges life might bring next. "I married a man I thought had no secrets," she told him that evening, reaching for his hand across the table. "But I fell in love again, more deeply, with the man who finally had the courage to reveal them and to become someone worthy of real trust in the process." Ethan squeezed her hand gently, gratitude washing over him as it did every single day since that terrifying phone call had first threatened to destroy everything he had built. He thought about Nathan Cole, the frightened young man who had once run from his own life rather than face it honestly, and felt a quiet, permanent peace knowing that he had finally, fully left that fear behind. The secret that had once threatened to destroy his marriage had instead become the very foundation upon which something far stronger had eventually been built. Not the fragile illusion of a perfect man with no shadows, but the genuine, hard-earned trust between two people who had faced the darkest parts of their story together, and chosen, again and again, to remain standing side by side.